In the shadows of medieval villages, justice didn't wait. There were no second chances. A whisper could turn into a sentence. And punishment wasn't just painful, it was unforgettable. Hangings, burnings, trials by fire. This was law and order, medieval style. But before you get too comfortable, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you enjoy what I'm doing here. And drop your city name and local time in the comments. We'd love to see where in the world you're watching from. In the medieval world, justice was not just a concept, it was survival. Crime, chaos, and violence lurked around every corner, from bustling city markets to remote villages deep in the forest. Without a strong central authority or modern police, people relied on a fragile system of customs, punishments, and local power to keep peace. Justice in the Middle Ages was as much about deterrence and social control as it was about truth or fairness. To understand how punishment worked, you first have to understand what law and order looked like in a world where kings ruled from castles. But most people lived in wooden huts, far from the reach of royal law. The earliest medieval justice systems were based on local custom and tradition. Before written laws spread across Europe, communities enforced rules passed down orally, laws shaped by tribe, religion, and necessity. These were not abstract principles. They were living rules meant to keep neighbors from killing each other over pigs, property, or insults. In Anglo-Saxon England, for example, crimes were often settled through wurgeld, a man price paid, to a victim's family. If you killed someone, you didn't go to jail. You paid compensation. A peasant might be worth 100 shillings. A nobleman? 10 times that. If you couldn't pay, your family might be forced to sell land or cattle. In extreme cases, you paid with your own life, but justice wasn't always so tidy. In many parts of medieval Europe, revenge and retribution still shaped the way crime was handled. A feud between families could last for generations, triggered by a single murder or theft. If the law failed, people took matters into their own hands. Blood spilled often led to more blood. That's why early kings tried to formalize justice, not just to stop the violence, but to show their own power. Law became a tool of authority, a way to assert control over land, taxes, and loyalty. By the High Middle Ages, around the 12th and 13th centuries, legal systems became more structured. Royal courts emerged, and written laws began to replace oral ones. Judges appointed by the king traveled from town to town, holding court and dispensing punishment. Church courts, too, had their own systems focused more on sin and morality than theft or murder. A person accused of adultery or heresy might find themselves judged by a bishop rather than a baron. And yet, despite this growing complexity, justice remained incredibly personal. There were no juries in the modern sense, no formal police. Communities were expected to keep order themselves. This led to the widespread use of tithings and oath systems. In England, 10 men were grouped into a tithing, each responsible for the other's behavior. If one committed a crime, the others had to produce him in court or face penalties themselves. It was peer pressure enforced by law. Swearing an oath was also central. If you were accused of a crime, you could declare your innocence, and others could swear on your behalf. The more serious the crime, the more people you needed to vouch for your honesty. These weren't witnesses to the crime. They were witnesses to your character. But what happened when there were no witnesses, no confessions, and no clear evidence? That's when medieval justice turned to something far more brutal: trial by ordeal. The logic was simple. If terrifying God would not let an innocent person suffer unjustly. So, if you were accused of theft, murder, or witchcraft, you might be forced to undergo a physical trial to prove your innocence. Ordeal by hot iron required you to carry a glowing rod for a few paces. Your hand was then bandaged for 3 days. If it healed cleanly, you were innocent. If not, you were guilty. Other ordeals included walking barefoot across hot plowshares or retrieving a stone from a boiling cauldron. If the burn festered, that was seen as divine judgment. These ordeals were not sideshows. They were official legal procedures, and people accepted them as legitimate. The church played a major role, blessing the ordeal and interpreting the results. It wasn't until the 13th century when Pope Innocent III banned clergy from participating in ordeals, that the practice began to fade. In its place came more rational methods like trial by jury, which slowly took hold in England. But even then, justice remained slow, unpredictable, and brutal. Medieval justice wasn't just about solving crimes. It was about restoring order, and public punishment played a key role. Whether it was a whipping in the market square, a branding on the cheek, or a thief hanging from the gallows, punishment was made to be seen. The spectacle mattered. It warned others not to follow the same path. A punishment that humiliated or maimed was considered effective. Stocks and pillories were common across towns and villages. A man caught cheating customers might be locked in the stocks, while townsfolk threw rotten vegetables or worse. A woman accused of gossip might be forced to wear a scold's bridle, an iron mask with a spiked mouthpiece. For serious crimes, the punishments were harsher still. Hanging was the standard penalty for theft, especially in England. In parts of Europe, breaking on the wheel was used for murderers, a horrifying execution, where the criminal's limbs were shattered one by one. Burnings were reserved for heretics or witches, and in some places, thieves lost a hand, poachers were blinded, and traitors were disemboweled. These weren't just punishments, they were warnings carved into flesh. But medieval justice was also full of contradictions. The rich and powerful often escaped the worst punishments, while the poor bore the full brunt of the law. Nobles might be executed by sword, a more honorable death, while peasants swung from the noose. Wealthy merchants could sometimes pay fines instead of serving time. Clergy accused of crimes could claim benefit of clergy and be tried in a church court where punishments were lighter. This legal loophole was often abused. Literacy was used as proof you were a clergyman. If you could read a passage from the Bible, you escaped harsher punishment. Over time, even lay people memorized the right verse to cheat the system. Yet in many communities, justice wasn't just top-down. Village elders, manorial courts, and local assemblies handled most disputes. These courts dealt with everyday problems, boundary disputes, petty theft, broken promises. Often, the goal wasn't punishment, but resolution. Fines, public apologies, or shaming rituals were common. In Iceland, the Althing gathered free men to settle disputes through legal argument. In some parts of France, local lords held court under large trees, hearing grievances and handing down verdicts before an audience of villagers. And justice wasn't only for the living. Execution sites were treated as sacred, and criminals were sometimes buried with their crimes engraved on stone. Bodies of murderers might be hung in chains as a warning. Yet there was also room for mercy. Some criminals sought sanctuary in churches, protected by religious law for up to 40 days. They could confess, make penance, or arrange exile. Others were spared by royal pardon. Their fates changed by politics or persuasion. In the world of medieval crime and punishment, law was not blind. It was deeply human, flawed, symbolic, and shaped by fear, faith, and power. For every hanging, there was a prayer. For every broken wheel, a whispered story. Justice lived not just in courts or gallows, but in the choices people made, the rules they followed, and the darkness they feared. Because in the medieval world, justice wasn't just about right and wrong, it was about keeping the world from falling apart. In a world without police stations or national criminal databases, the idea of law enforcement looked very different in medieval times. Justice, law, and order weren't maintained by a centralized force, but rather by a patchwork of authority figures, customs, and overlapping jurisdictions. The king might sit at the top of the legal pyramid, but most people lived their lives under the watchful eyes of sheriffs, bailiffs, stewards, and lords. Each had power. Each could demand obedience, and each played a part in upholding a fragile and often frightening form of medieval order. For the average medieval villager, law was local, and the face of that law was often a steward or reeve, the man appointed by the local lord to manage his estate. These men weren't full-time enforcers like modern police, but they held authority over the land and the people who worked it. A reeve could settle disputes, enforce curfews, collect fines, and oversee the manor court where most crimes were dealt with. For many, justice began and ended on the lord's land, The manorial court, held by the lord or his steward, was the most common form of legal proceeding. It wasn't grand or formal often, just a gathering under a tree or in the local hall, with villagers presenting their grievances. Disputes over livestock, trespassing, broken contracts, or petty theft were heard in front of neighbors. Witnesses were rare. Instead, people swore oaths. The idea was not to prove guilt, but to maintain the peace. The focus was on restoring order to the community, not exploring abstract truth. A man might be fined for allowing his pigs to wander onto another's land. A woman might be ordered to publicly apologize for slander. These judgments kept daily life from descending into chaos. But crimes more serious than cattle-rustling murder, arson, rape, rebellion required a higher authority. That's where the king's justice stepped in. In England, the role of the sheriff became central by the 12th century. Appointed by the crown, the sheriff acted as the king's hand in each county. He could summon juries, gather militias, arrest criminals, and collect taxes. If someone fled a manor court or committed a capital offense, the sheriff was expected to hunt them down. He could also call for a hue and cry, an official public alert that obligated all townsfolk to help catch a fleeing criminal. Refusal to join the chase could lead to fines or suspicion. In theory, the king's law applied to everyone from noble to peasant. But in practice, justice varied wildly, depending on where you stood in society. A noble accused of a crime might be tried in a royal court or in parliament, surrounded by peers and advocates. A commoner, by contrast, might face summary judgment in a market square with no legal counsel and few protections. The law was not equal. It was steeped in class, influence, and proximity to power. Still, monarchs across Europe worked to standardize justice to assert control over unruly lands. Kings like Henry II of England revolutionized royal law by creating traveling judges, justices, and heir, who moved from town to town, holding formal court sessions. These judges helped ensure the king's laws were applied across the kingdom, and not just where the monarch physically ruled. For the first time, English common law began to emerge recorded judgments, repeatable processes, and a growing sense that law could be consistent, even if not always fair. These royal judges oversaw assize courts, where felonies were tried before large audiences. They summoned local jurors, men familiar with the accused, to offer information. This early form of jury trial wasn't yet impartial. Jurors were more like community informants, expected to tell what they knew about the accused. The goal wasn't to debate law, but to determine guilt and deliver swift punishment. If found guilty, the sentence could be immediate execution. But what if the accused never showed up? In many cases, fugitives vanished into forests or distant villages. Law enforcement was limited by speed, geography, and manpower. Wanted men could disappear for years. Yet if they were caught, their fate was bleak. Some were held in prisons, but medieval jails weren't meant for punishment. They were temporary holding cells. Cold, damp, and disease-ridden, they were often more dangerous than the crime. Those imprisoned awaited trial or punishment, but rarely served a sentence. As we think of today, justice also had a religious dimension. The church wielded immense legal power, especially over moral crimes like adultery, blasphemy, or heresy. Church courts were less brutal, but no less serious. Clergy were tried here, even for secular crimes, a loophole known as benefit of clergy. This led to widespread abuse. Literate criminals would claim to be clergy to avoid harsher royal courts. All they had to do was read a verse from the Bible, typically Psalm 51, known as the neck verse, because it could save your neck from the noose. Church courts imposed penance, excommunication, or pilgrimage as punishment. A man caught cheating on his wife might be forced to walk barefoot to a shrine. A woman accused of spreading false rumors might have to fast or publicly confess. But for those accused of heresy, the outcome could be deadly. The church viewed heresy as a spiritual infection, and during periods of heightened fear like the Inquisition, accused heretics were tortured or handed over to secular courts for execution. The church might claim it shed no blood, but it didn't mind if others did on its behalf. Order in medieval towns was maintained, not just by officials, but by the citizens themselves. Night watchmen, unpaid volunteers, patrolled streets after dark. If they saw suspicious behavior, they could arrest or raise the hue and cry. In some places, entire neighborhoods were organized into mutual responsibility groups, similar to tithings. If someone committed a crime, the group had to produce them or face the punishment collectively. This system wasn't perfect, but it created accountability and communal enforcement. Justice was also enforced through rituals and performance. Trials and executions weren't quiet, bureaucratic events. They were theatrical. A judge in flowing robes, armed guards, a crowd of villagers craning to hear the verdict. Guilt was declared with a loud voice. Punishment was carried out in public squares, with the whole town as witness. This was intentional. Medieval justice was performative. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was deterrence. Seeing a man's ear cut off or his body swinging from a gallows was meant to implant fear and discipline in the hearts of onlookers. Yet for all this structure, medieval justice was still often arbitrary and cruel. A man might be hanged for stealing a loaf of bread, while a corrupt noble avoided any penalty. The idea of fairness existed, but it was a luxury. The law served stability, hierarchy, and the will of those in power more than the individual's rights. Still, beneath all its flaws, the system worked for them. It kept the peace, however brutally. It resolved disputes, however unevenly. It reminded the people that someone was always watching, whether it was the sheriff, the priest, or God himself. Because in the medieval world, law and order weren't about ideals. They were about survival. For all the dramatic trials and royal decrees passed down from kings and bishops, most medieval people never set foot in a royal courtroom. They lived and died under the rule of their local lord, and justice was something handled just a few fields away, often right in the village center. Here, in the shadows of timber-framed halls and thatched roofs, the manorial court reigned supreme. It was where community life met the law, where crime was judged not by a distant authority, but by neighbors and fellow tenants. A manorial court was the judicial backbone of the countryside. Every manor essentially, a large farming estate run by a lord, had its own court, held regularly in a local hall, or sometimes even outdoors beneath a tree. All who lived and worked on the land, from free tenants to villains, unfree peasants, were subject to its authority. Attendance wasn't optional. Villagers were expected to show up, report crimes, witness punishments, and in many cases, help administer justice. The system was built not just to keep order, but to make sure that everyone played their part in maintaining it. The lord of the manor, or more commonly, his appointed steward or bailiff, presided over these proceedings. But they didn't pass judgment alone. Local men, often landholders or trusted elders, acted as jurors or assessors. These weren't like modern juries. Their job wasn't to evaluate evidence, but to uphold known facts, report wrongdoing, and suggest punishments. Everyone knew everyone else. If your neighbor let his pigs destroy your barley crop, or if someone stole a chicken from your coop, it would be dealt with here, with all eyes watching. Crimes tried in manorial courts were usually petty offenses, but they weren't trivial. Things like letting animals wander, stealing firewood, brewing and selling ale without a license, or failing to attend church could all lead to legal trouble. These minor violations might seem laughable now, but in a tightly regulated community where resources were scarce and social roles rigid, such offenses were serious disruptions to order. A man who allowed his sheep to graze on another's pasture wasn't just breaking a rule, he was undermining the balance of the village economy. Fines were the most common punishment. Not because they were lenient, but because they were practical. A lord didn't want to lose laborers to execution or maiming. He needed his tenants working the land. So if you committed a crime, you were usually fined. The amount varied depending on your status and the severity of the offense. Repeat offenders paid more, and if you couldn't pay, you might be forced to do additional labor or forfeit livestock. A peasant might lose a pig or part of their harvest. As payment for wrongdoing, sometimes, punishment was designed not just to hurt your wallet, but to hurt your pride. Public shaming was a powerful tool in medieval justice. A common punishment was to be placed in the stocks or pillory, simple wooden devices that held your arms, legs, or head in place while the townsfolk gathered to mock or pelt you with whatever they had on hand. Rotten vegetables, animal dung, sharp words. Children laughed, elders scowled. The purpose wasn't just punishment, it was humiliation. A baker who sold bad bread might spend a day in the stocks, wearing a sign that said, "Sheet." A gossip could be paraded through the streets with a symbol of her sin hung around her neck knot. In some villages, more creative punishments were used. A woman caught spreading lies might be made to carry a stone around the village square for an hour. A man who insulted his neighbor could be ordered to kneel before them and publicly apologize while the crowd watched. These scenes were not just for entertainment, they were lessons. The whole community was reminded of what happened when someone stepped out of line. And when everyone lived so close together, reputation was everything. Another widely feared punishment was the cucking stool, a chair mounted on a long wooden beam used to dunk. Offenders, usually women, accused of being scolds or disorderly in a pond or river, dragged through the village, jeered by neighbors, and dunked into freezing water. The experience was both physically painful and socially devastating. Though it was mostly symbolic, the cucking stool carried a message: keep your mouth shut, or the village will silence you. Manorial courts also enforced moral order. Adultery, drunkenness, laziness, and even failure to attend Mass could be punished. While the church held formal authority over the soul, local lords took it upon themselves to enforce expected behavior. A man caught fornicating with a servant girl might be fined or ordered to undergo penance. A woman accused of being a night walker, a euphemism for a prostitute, could be publicly whipped or banished from the village. The system wasn't always cruel. It was often about preserving peace rather than delivering harsh justice. Many disputes were settled by mediation. If a tenant accused his neighbor of stealing tools, the two might be brought before the court and encouraged to make amends. Compensation would be negotiated. Both parties would shake hands. The goal was to restore harmony, not create endless cycles of revenge. Justice in this context was about balance, not vengeance. Still, the court's decisions could be arbitrary. The Lord Steward had a great deal of discretion. Bias, favoritism, or bribery could easily influence outcomes. A wealthy tenant might escape punishment for a crime that saw a poor man publicly shamed. Power, as always, protected those who held it. What gave manorial courts their strength was not physical force, but community consensus. Everyone played a part. The villagers watched. They remembered who was punished and why. The threat of being ostracized, mocked, or distrusted was a powerful deterrent. People didn't fear prison, they feared shame. In a world where your neighbors were your coworkers, your extended family, your only protection and your only market, being marked as dishonest or troublesome could ruin you. And so, law and order weren't just about rules, they were about rhythms. The rhythm of planting and harvesting, of festivals and church bells, of seasonal gatherings and local courts. Justice wasn't separate from life, it was woven into it. You knew when court was being held. You knew the steward's face. You watched your neighbors as they watched you. When royal courts or bishops did intervene in rural matters, it was often met with confusion or resentment. Their laws seemed distant, their methods foreign. Local justice was slower, messier, but more familiar. It reflected the values of the village. Work hard, respect the land, don't disturb the peace, and keep your oaths. For centuries, these small courts formed the bedrock of medieval legal culture. Long before centralized governments took control, justice was handled in muddy yards and smoky halls by people who had known each other their whole lives. They believed in shame more than shackles, in reconciliation more than retribution, and in keeping the peace, even if it meant punishing one of their own in full view of the crowd. Because in the medieval village, justice wasn't just law, it was a living, breathing part of everyday life. By the 12th century, the way crime and punishment were handled in medieval Europe was beginning to shift. Manorial courts and village justice still dominated rural life, but a new force was rising: the king's law. Monarchs, once mere warlords, with loose control over scattered territories, began asserting their authority, not just through armies and castles, but through legal reform. With every royal charter and judicial innovation, the crown tightened its grip on law and order, transforming justice from a local, communal affair into a tool of centralized power. This change wasn't driven solely by the idea of fairness. It was also political. For a king, controlling the courts meant controlling the land, the people, and the flow of money through fines, fees, and property seizures. When royal law expanded, it wasn't just about punishing crime, it was about extending influence. One of the earliest and most influential kings to reshape justice was Henry II of England, who reigned in the 12th century. Known for strengthening the English monarchy, Henry saw the value of law not just as a means of order, but as a strategy for consolidation. He established the Assize of Clarendon in 1166, a royal decree that created traveling judges called justices in Eyre, who moved from county to county, holding court on the king's behalf. This wasn't just about convenience. It allowed the king to override the influence of local lords and enforce his own legal standards across the realm. This system introduced a crucial innovation, the use of grand juries. Under Henry's reforms, 12 local men were required to report under oath any known crimes or suspicious behavior in their area. These were not trial juries as we know them today. They didn't determine guilt or innocence. Instead, they acted as informants for the crown, ensuring that serious crimes, murder, robbery, arson, were brought to royal attention, not swept under the manorial rug. The accused, once identified, would be brought to trial in front of a judge. Early on, guilt was still often determined through traditional methods, like trial by ordeal. These ordeals carrying hot iron, immersion in boiling water, or being bound and thrown into a river were believed to allow divine intervention. If the accused survived or healed quickly, it was proof of innocence. These brutal methods, officially sanctioned by both the church and state, were seen as direct appeals to God's judgment. But in 1215, everything changed. The Fourth Lateran Council, led by Pope Innocent III, banned clergy from participating in ordeals. Without priests to bless and oversee them, ordeals lost legitimacy. This forced secular courts, especially in England, to seek alternative methods of deciding guilt. Enter the petty jury, an early version of the modern trial jury. These juries consisted of local men, usually 12, who were expected to know the accused and the community well. They weren't impartial strangers, but peers of the defendant. Their task was to determine guilt based on what they knew, what they had heard, and what others swore to. In truth, these early juries were often more about community reputation than hard evidence. A man known to be troublesome, even if not caught red-handed, could be convicted on the strength of rumor and distrust alone. Still, this shift marked a major moment in legal history. The move from divine judgment to human judgment, however flawed, laid the groundwork for future legal systems based on argument, examination, and reason, rather than superstition and spectacle. But not everyone welcomed this new model. The church, which had long wielded power over morality and justice, saw the crown's growing legal machinery as a threat. The tension between church and crown simmered for decades, sometimes erupting into full-blown conflict. A famous example is the dispute between Henry II and Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry wanted to reduce the church's legal privileges, especially the ability of clergy to be tried in church courts, where punishments were lighter and sentences less brutal. Becket resisted fiercely, arguing that spiritual men should answer only to spiritual law. The conflict became so bitter that it ended with Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral by knights loyal to the king. His death shocked Europe, and Becket became a martyr. But in the long run, the church was forced to cede some legal ground. This battle over who held the authority to punish sin and crime, the king or the church, continued to shape medieval justice for centuries. In some countries, royal courts grew stronger, creating more standardized systems. In others, church influence remained dominant, especially in cases involving heresy, marriage, and morality. By the late 13th century, royal law had expanded into towns and cities, establishing common law, a growing body of legal precedents that could be applied across the kingdom. Judges recorded their decisions, and future cases looked back to them. This gave birth to the idea that the law could be consistent, predictable, and impartial. While still imperfect and deeply biased toward the wealthy and powerful, this system marked a turning point in how medieval people thought about justice. Still, most people remained suspicious of royal courts. They were distant, expensive, and filled with unfamiliar procedures. If you were a poor farmer, getting summoned to a royal court could mean days of travel, lost wages, and a complicated process you didn't understand. And so, local justice manorial courts, village shaming, and tithing groups continued to thrive alongside the king's law. The two systems existed side by side, often overlapping, occasionally clashing. Meanwhile, punishments under royal law remained public and painful. Execution was common for serious crimes, particularly theft, rebellion, or treason. For less severe offenses, punishments included flogging, branding, mutilation, or exposure in the pillory. The point wasn't just to punish the criminal. It was to show everyone watching what would happen to them if they disobeyed the king's law. Royal courts also enforced economic and regulatory laws. Selling bread that was underweight, cheating customers, using false measurements, or breaking trade rules could result in steep fines or corporal punishment. Even markets were arenas of law and order. Kings saw legal control over trade as essential to stability and tax revenue. Justice in this sense wasn't just moral, it was administrative. All of this was recorded meticulously in court rolls, legal registers, and royal decrees. The growth of written law was perhaps the most powerful tool in the expansion of royal justice. What was once remembered and passed down orally became recorded, enforceable, and backed by the authority of the crown. Justice in the medieval world was still harsh and unbalanced, but it was evolving. Trial by ordeal gave way to trial by jury. Customary law began to merge with royal statute, and the idea that law could be applied by rule rather than revenge or whim began to take hold. Yet, even as the crown's grip tightened and the courts expanded, most people still lived in the shadow of their local lord, still feared the wrath of their neighbors, and still understood justice not as an ideal, but as a presence. A presence that could condemn you with a word, spare you with a bribe, or remind you that someone, somewhere, always had the power to judge. Medieval punishment was designed to make a statement. In a world where kings ruled with divine authority, and law was often enforced by fear more than fairness, the consequences for breaking the rules were intentionally brutal, unforgettable, and most importantly public. Whether a thief was being flogged, a gossip placed in the pillory, or a traitor drawn and quartered, medieval justice demanded not just retribution, but a display of power. Punishment wasn't done in private. It was a performance, and the audience was everyone. The most common punishments for everyday crimes were fines, shaming, and corporal punishment. Fines made sense. Lords and kings profited from them, and they preserved labor. But for crimes that couldn't be easily paid off, or for repeat offenders, pain and humiliation became the tools of choice. Steal something, and you might lose a hand. Lie or spread slander, and your tongue might be burned. Cheat a customer, and you might be branded with a hot iron, literally marked for life. One of the most iconic punishments was the pillory, a wooden structure with holes for the head and hands. Placed in the town square or near the market, the pillory trapped the offender in place, vulnerable to the jeers and missiles of the crowd. Rotten vegetables, mud, rocks, or worse were thrown by onlookers. This wasn't just punishment, it was a ritual of humiliation. The crowd participated in enforcing justice, making the criminal feel the weight of communal anger. Similarly, the stocks, which bound a criminal's ankles and sometimes wrists, left people exposed to mockery, spit, and freezing weather. Time spent in the stocks could range from a few hours to days. The message was clear: you've broken the law, and now the community gets to break you, piece by piece, with laughter, scorn, and pain. But physical punishment could escalate quickly. For theft, amputation was common across parts of Europe. The right hand was often removed, sometimes on the first offense, other times only after a repeat conviction. Mutilation wasn't just meant to hurt, it was meant to linger. A man with one hand was instantly recognized as a criminal. His body carried the memory of his crime for the rest of his life. In some cases, thieves were branded burned with hot irons on the cheek or forehead with letters like T for thief or F for felon. Justice could also be poetic and cruelly specific. A baker who cheated customers by selling underweight bread might be tied to a cart and dragged through town with a loaf hung around his neck. A woman known for spreading rumors might be forced to wear a heavy scold's bridle and iron cage fitted over the head with a sharp metal plate pressing down on the tongue to keep her silent. The pain, humiliation, and inability to speak made it one of the most feared punishments for women. Water played a frequent role in punishment, especially for women. The cucking stool, a chair, attached to a long wooden beam, was used to dunk offenders into a river or pond. Originally used for disorderly women, prostitutes, or those accused of witchcraft, it quickly became a tool of symbolic cleansing. A woman might be paraded through town, tied to the stool, and then dunked repeatedly into icy water while villagers cheered. The goal wasn't death, but it came dangerously close, and sometimes punishment did mean death. The gallows stood tall in many towns, often on a hill or central square. Execution by hanging was the most common form of capital punishment, especially for theft, poaching, murder, or rebellion. It was a swift sentence, but not always a swift death. Many hangings were botched, and some criminals suffered slowly, strangling over several minutes while the crowd looked on. In some places, gibbeting followed where the hanged body was, left on display in a metal cage for weeks or months as a warning to others. For the worst crimes, treason, heresy, or especially brutal murders, punishment was far more gruesome. In England, traitors were hanged, drawn, and quartered. First hanged, but not until dead, then disemboweled while still alive, then beheaded. And finally, their body was cut into quarters and sent to the corners of the kingdom. This punishment was reserved for those who had betrayed the king or the realm, and it was done not just to punish, but to shock and horrify. It was the ultimate message: defy authority, and you will be erased. Similarly, burning at the stake was used, especially for heretics and witches. The church sanctioned this punishment, believing fire was a purifying element. The condemned was tied to a post, and dry wood was piled around their feet. Sometimes, if the crowd or executioner was merciful, the person would be strangled or hanged first. But not always. Inquisitions and moral panics often led to mass burnings, especially in Spain, France, and parts of Germany. Yet even executions were not only about the law, they were about ritual and symbolism. A criminal might be forced to confess, pray, or ask forgiveness before death. A priest might walk beside them, offering final salvation. The crowd gathered not just to see justice done, but to be reminded of the rules they lived under, the line between life and death, loyalty and treason, sin and salvation. Some punishments blurred the lines between sacred and legal. A criminal might be sentenced to public penance, walking barefoot through town, wearing sackcloth, carrying a candle, and begging for forgiveness. In other cases, especially with church courts, a sentence might involve fasting, pilgrimage, or the building of a shrine. This wasn't mercy. It was punishment by spiritual exhaustion. It shamed the body while demanding redemption from the soul. There were also punishments meant to banish or isolate. A criminal could be exiled from a town or region. Others were declared outlaws, meaning they could be killed on sight without punishment. To be outlawed was to be stripped of all protection. No one could shelter you, feed you, or speak for you. It was a social death, just as final as the gallows. And yet, amid all this brutality, there were moments of mercy. A nobleman might be executed by sword instead of hanging, considered a cleaner, more honorable death. A woman could be spared the flames if she was pregnant. A prisoner might receive a royal pardon if influential friends petitioned on his behalf. In some cities, convicted criminals could appeal to local saints, walking barefoot to a cathedral and claiming sanctuary. The church offered temporary protection in sacred spaces. A criminal could flee into a church and claim asylum for up to 40 days. During that time, no one could touch him. The goal was not to escape punishment forever, but to negotiate terms, confess, agree to exile, or prepare for a more peaceful surrender. Sanctuary was both a legal loophole and a moral stage. Some used it to save their lives. Others abused it until politics closed the doors for good. Punishment in the medieval world wasn't just about controlling crime. It was about enforcing the social order. Every blow, burn, and branding told the people where they stood. Lords could be fined. Peasants were flogged. A king might pardon a noble, but a starving thief was shown no mercy. Punishment reflected power, and power was everything. Even so, most people didn't question the system. They feared it, respected it, and believed in it. In a world where chaos lurked beyond the village walls, where war, famine, and disease were constant threats, justice had to be harsh. It had to be seen. It had to remind people that their lives were watched, judged, and shaped by a force greater than themselves. Because in the medieval world, the price of crime wasn't just pain. It was a warning carved into flesh and burned into memory. In the medieval world, crime wasn't just a matter of broken laws. It was a breach in the delicate web of order that held society, faith, and community together. To sin was to offend God, but to commit a crime was to offend the entire structure of earthly life. The distinction between the two was blurry. Often they overlapped entirely. In fact, many people didn't see much difference between a thief and a heretic, or a gossip and a witch. All were seen as threats, not just to individuals, but to the moral and social balance that allowed villages, towns, and kingdoms to survive. At the heart of it, crime in the medieval mind was not just what you did, it was what you disturbed. Order was sacred, so anything that created disruption, whether it was violence, dishonesty, sexual sin, or speaking against authority, became subject to punishment. Sometimes this meant breaking written laws, but more often it meant violating customs, expectations, and collective beliefs that had existed for generations. Start with theft, perhaps the most common and universally condemned crime of the period. In a time when most people lived close to the edge of survival, stealing even a loaf of bread or a hen wasn't just petty, it could be deadly for the victim. A stolen tool could ruin a harvest. A missing pig could starve a family. And yet, theft was also a crime of desperation. With famine, plague, and failed crops haunting every season, many who stole were simply trying to eat. The courts rarely cared. Mercy was a luxury, and punishment was swift fines if you were lucky, whipping or hanging if you were not. Then there was violence. Brawls were common, especially among men, and some level of fighting was often tolerated, particularly if it stayed within one social class. A drunken scuffle between two peasants might earn a fine and a warning, but if someone died or if weapons were used, it became a matter for royal justice. Murder was taken seriously, but even it was not always punished equally. A noble who killed a peasant might escape punishment entirely, but if a commoner attacked someone of higher status, the penalty could be death, even if it wasn't fatal. The law protected the powerful first and foremost. Not all crimes involved blood or theft. Many centered on morality, especially in the eyes of the church. Adultery, fornication, incest, and homosexuality were all viewed as criminal sins. While royal courts didn't always handle these offenses, ecclesiastical courts did church-run tribunals that judged the soul rather than the body. A man caught in adultery might be ordered to fast, to make a pilgrimage, or to publicly confess his sins. In some regions, he might be paraded through the streets in shame. A woman accused of bearing a child out of wedlock could be fined, whipped, or ostracized from her village. One of the most heavily policed moral crimes was blasphemy, speaking disrespectfully of God, the saints, or sacred rituals. In a world where nearly everything revolved around the church calendar, religious festivals, and mass, words carried weight. To curse during a church service or mock a priest was to invite divine punishment and often very real earthly consequences. In some towns, those accused of blasphemy were forced to kneel in the town square with a rope around their neck and a candle in hand, reciting prayers of repentance in front of the watching crowd. Witchcraft and sorcery occupied a complicated space in medieval law. In early medieval Europe, belief in magic was widespread, but it wasn't always treated as criminal. Many villages had wise women, midwives, or herbalists, who were both feared and respected for their knowledge. But when something went wrong, a bad harvest, a sudden illness, a stillborn child, these same women could become scapegoats. Accusations of witchcraft were often born from superstition, jealousy, or religious paranoia, and although large-scale, witch trials didn't peak until the Renaissance and early modern periods. The seeds of fear were already planted in the Middle Ages. Those accused of sorcery could face ecclesiastical trial, and punishments ranged from excommunication to burning. Confessions were often extracted through torture, not for legal proof, but for moral clarity. The Church believed that the body could be broken to save the soul. This rationale led to nightmarish scenes where women and men, desperate to stop the pain, confessed to consorting with demons, flying through the night, or poisoning neighbors with magic. Whether true or not didn't matter. What mattered was restoring order. Another category of crime that blurred legal and moral lines was heresy, holding beliefs contrary to the teachings of the Church. In a deeply religious world, questioning Church authority wasn't just dissent, it was dangerous. Heresy threatened the salvation of souls and the unity of Christendom. Therefore, it was treated as a crime of the highest order. Heretics were arrested, interrogated, tortured, and if unrepentant, executed. Some were burned at the stake, their ashes scattered to prevent martyrdom. But even everyday behavior could be criminalized if it disrupted social harmony. For example, gossip wasn't just an annoyance, it was a punishable offense in many manorial courts. A woman who slandered her neighbor could be fined, shamed, or even whipped. Men who spread false rumors or incited disputes could face similar punishment. Words had power, and the community feared the ripple effects of scandal. Likewise, laziness, drunkenness, or disrespect toward elders could be considered criminal behavior, not because they broke specific statutes, but because they violated the unwritten rules of order. There was also vagrancy, the crime of having no job, no home, and no visible purpose. After the Black Death ravaged Europe and left labor shortages everywhere, wandering beggars became more common and more feared. Authorities saw them not as victims of plague and poverty, but as dangerous outsiders who might steal, spread disease, or incite rebellion. Laws were passed requiring people to work, to stay within their birth parishes, and to carry proof of employment. Those without could be whipped, branded, or forced into labor. The idle poor became symbolic of social decay and were punished, not for what they did, but for what they represented. And yet, some of the most severe crimes were those committed not against individuals, but against authority itself. Speaking out against a lord, refusing to pay a tax, resisting a conscription order, or leading a peasant rebellion. These were all considered forms of treason, even if they were born from desperation or injustice. The ruling class saw any challenge to their rule as an existential threat. And so, punishments were harsh, and examples were made. Rebels were hanged, their bodies displayed on bridges and gates. Their families were fined, their lands seized. Justice in these cases was not about fairness, it was about domination. Through it all, community enforcement remained central. People watched each other, reported offenses, and participated in punishment. Shame and public knowledge were as powerful as swords. Your neighbors knew what you said, what you did, and how often you went to church. A bad reputation could be as damning as an actual conviction. In the medieval mind, crime was not just legal. It was spiritual. It was personal. It was about keeping the delicate fabric of village life intact. Every act of theft, gossip, or defiance was a loose thread threatening to unravel the whole. And so, the response had to be swift, symbolic, and total. Because in the medieval world, a crime was not just against law, it was against the soul of society. In the brutal world of medieval justice, it's easy to focus on the punishment, on the hangings, the whippings, the public humiliation. But beneath all of that was something just as important: prevention. Keeping crime from happening in the first place was a constant struggle. With no police force, no cameras, and little literacy, medieval communities had to rely on a mix of communal surveillance, fear, religion, and rigid social structures to keep people in line. Most towns and villages were small and tightly knit. Everyone knew everyone else. That alone was a deterrent. If you stole something, someone would notice. If you lied, word would spread. In many ways, crime prevention wasn't handled by officials. It was handled by neighbors. This was the age of everyone is watching. One of the most important systems for maintaining order was the tithing system, especially in England. Every male over the age of 12 was grouped into a tithing of 10 men. These 10 were held mutually responsible for each other's behavior. If one committed a crime, the others were expected to report him or risk being punished as accomplices. It created a powerful incentive to keep your friends and relatives in line. Tithings were often part of larger hundreds and shires, forming the backbone of rural law enforcement. The threat of shared punishment kept people honest. This idea of collective responsibility extended beyond the tithing. In many areas, when a crime occurred, it triggered a hue and cry. This was not just a call for help, it was a legal obligation. If someone saw a crime being committed, they were required to raise the alarm, literally yelling out and chasing the offender. Everyone within earshot was expected to drop what they were doing and join the pursuit. Failure to respond meant fines. For the entire village, imagine the sound of church bells ringing out not for prayer, but to warn of a thief in the woods or a fight near the market. The community would pour out of their homes, forming a posse to catch the criminal. There were no detectives or forensics. Justice was swift, and crime prevention relied on communal energy. In towns, crime prevention took a more organized shape. Many medieval cities had watchmen men paid or assigned to patrol the streets at night, armed with clubs and lanterns. They walked in pairs, calling out the hour and challenging anyone found outside after dark. Curfews were strictly enforced. The word curfew itself comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. At a certain hour, all fires were to be extinguished and people indoors, to reduce the chance of nighttime chaos or accidental blazes. Being out after curfew, without a clear reason, was considered suspicious, even criminal. If you were caught on the street at night, you could be questioned, detained, or beaten, especially if you couldn't prove your identity or your purpose. To prevent theft, gates to walled cities were often locked after dark, and key roads were blocked off. The night was feared. Darkness hid criminals, spirits, and enemies. So the answer was control. Some towns had early forms of night signals or alarm systems. A bell might be rung if danger approached. Fires were used to communicate trouble in rural areas, especially if raiders or outlaws were nearby. In castles, horns and banners signaled threats. These systems weren't foolproof, but they were part of the medieval effort to create layers of security in an unpredictable world. Another form of crime prevention was surveillance through religion. Priests were expected to report signs of moral decay. Confession, though private, sometimes became a tool of control. If someone hinted at wrongdoing, the priest could warn local authorities discreetly. More directly, the pulpit became a platform for discouraging sin. Hellfire sermons, delivered regularly, reminded congregations that even thinking about crime risked eternal damnation. Sins were preached about not just as spiritual failings, but as social threats. Greed led to theft, lust led to adultery, or, worse, pride led to rebellion. By linking crime to the soul's fate, the church became a powerful ally of the state in keeping people obedient. The fear of divine punishment of hell, demons, or purgatory was every bit as real as the fear of manorial courts. Prevention also came in the form of regulation. In towns, craftsmen were often part of guilds organized, trade groups that not only protected their members' rights, but enforced standards. A guild might expel or publicly shame a member who cheated customers. They might inspect shops for quality. These actions weren't just about reputation, they were legal in nature. A baker selling short-weight loaves wasn't just immoral. He was a criminal, and the guild helped police its own. Markets and fairs were heavily monitored. Weights and measures were inspected. Criers and bailiffs moved among the stalls, watching for signs of fraud. Licenses were needed to sell goods, brew ale, or host gambling. People could and did report suspicious behavior, and if caught cheating, the punishment was often public exposure or a fine. The idea was to discourage dishonesty before it happened. In villages, prevention was more informal. Community gossip acted as an early warning system. A man who mistreated his wife or beat his animals might find his name whispered from cottage to cottage. Eventually, someone would bring it to the court. Reputation was a currency, and once it was damaged, it was hard to recover. People kept their behavior in check, not just because of the law, but because they feared becoming a target of scorn or revenge. Even architecture played a role in crime prevention. Many houses had narrow doors, making it hard to remove large stolen items. Churches had strong locks and were often among the best-built structures in a village. Castles were designed not only for warfare, but for control. Gatehouses, guard towers, and portcullises weren't just for defense against invaders. They also kept subjects in line. In the countryside, the lord's presence was a deterrent. Armed retainers rode the fields. The manor's bailiff kept watch on the peasants. Forest laws protected royal lands, and gamekeepers were authorized to shoot poachers on sight. Signs of rebellion or lawbreaking could bring harsh retaliation, not just for individuals, but for entire villages. And still, fear was perhaps the strongest tool. The punishment was harsh, public, and often irreversible. A child who watched a neighbor whipped or branded for stealing a chicken would think twice before risking the same fate. A woman who saw another dunked in the cucking stool would hesitate before speaking too boldly. The pain was one thing, but the shame was unforgettable. The message was everywhere. The law was watching. The church was listening. The neighbors were whispering. And one wrong move could land you in the stocks or the grave. Yet despite all this, crime still happened. People were desperate. They were human. They made mistakes or acted out of anger, need, or survival. No amount of surveillance could stop it entirely. But the medieval world never stopped trying, because keeping the peace wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about creating fear, obedience, and order so deep that people would police themselves. For all the talk of order, courts, and punishment, the medieval world was filled with people who lived beyond the law. Outlaws, bandits, mercenaries, rebels, and rootless wanderers who rejected or were rejected by society. These weren't just fictional characters in ballads and legends. They were real people, dangerous and desperate, who haunted the forests, mountains, and roads between towns. Their presence terrified authorities and thrilled the common folk, who sometimes viewed them not just as criminals, but as symbols of freedom, defiance, and revenge. To become an outlaw in the medieval sense didn't simply mean living outside the law. It meant being legally declared outside its protection. Once outlawed, a person lost all legal rights. They could not appear in court, could not be defended, and most strikingly, could be killed by anyone without punishment. It was a kind of social execution. You didn't have to die immediately. The law simply ceased to recognize you as a person. This punishment was especially common in England and parts of Scandinavia, where outlawry was formalized through legal ritual. If a person failed to appear in court or committed a crime and fled, they could be declared an outlaw by the local sheriff or by royal decree. They were then expected to disappear or face the sword. Some outlaws went into hiding. Others fought back. Many found refuge in the forests, which were vast, thick, and largely ungovernable. Royal forests in particular were dangerous places, not just for their wildlife and terrain, but for the people who took shelter there. These woods became home to poachers, deserters, escaped serfs, and exiled criminals. Some formed bands, robbing travelers and raiding outlying farms. Others simply tried to survive, moving at night and begging when they could. The image of the noble outlaw, the rebel who steals from the rich, to feed the poor, was popularized in legends like Robin Hood, but the reality was grimmer. Most bandits were not champions of justice. They were survivors, violent, cunning, and often ruthless. They robbed indiscriminately. They killed when necessary. They existed in a constant state of hunger, cold, and fear. Still, some became folk heroes. In areas where lords were cruel and taxes unbearable, peasants sometimes cheered for the outlaws who struck back. The authorities saw them as parasites. The poor saw them as rebels. In parts of France, Italy, and Germany, bandit leaders were known by name. Their stories passed on in taverns and marketplaces. Songs were written about them, part truth, part wishful thinking. Banditry surged during times of crisis. After wars, famines, or plagues, the number of ruthless men skyrocketed. Armies disbanded, leaving trained fighters with no work and no home. Crops failed, pushing people to steal to survive. Whole regions became unstable. Roads were no longer safe. Merchants traveled with armed escorts or not at all. One of the worst outbreaks of lawlessness followed the Black Death, which killed nearly half of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. So many people died that labor became scarce, and the social order began to crack. Some people abandoned their roles altogether, fleeing their manors or turning to crime. The Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351 in England, was meant to lock workers back into place, banning them from seeking better wages. Those who defied it were hunted, and many became fugitives. Authorities responded with force. Kings sent justices on circuit, empowered to investigate and crush organized bands. Rewards were offered for captured outlaws, especially if they were killed during arrest. Sheriffs organized patrols. Lords raised militias to defend their lands, but it was rarely enough. The forests remained wild, and the bandits kept coming. Some towns created watch lists, naming known outlaws and banning anyone from giving them shelter. Informers were paid. Families were pressured to turn in their own kin. In some cases, entire villages were punished for harboring criminals, but enforcement was difficult. The countryside was wide, and justice moved slowly. Not all criminals lived in the woods. Some operated within the cities. Urban banditry took different forms: burglary, pickpocketing, prostitution, extortion. Gangs formed in the alleys and underworlds of medieval cities, especially in growing trade hubs like London, Paris, and Florence. Thieves' guilds are more legend than fact, but there were certainly networks of criminals who worked together, shared information, and bribed officials. One method of urban crime was the confidence trick. A well-dressed man might pose as a merchant or noble, gain a victim's trust, and then disappear with his money. Another method was cut-pursing, slicing coin pouches from belts in crowded markets. Children were often used in these crimes, trained to slip through crowds unnoticed. If caught, they were punished harshly, especially if they were repeat offenders. But for many, it was better than starving. Some criminals turned their talents toward organized rebellion. Throughout the Middle Ages, there were uprisings, some small, some massive, driven by poverty, injustice, or hunger. These weren't always criminal in nature, but they were treated as such by the state. Leaders were executed, followers scattered, and anyone connected to the cause was marked as a traitor. From the peasants' revolt in England to rural uprisings in Germany and France, many of these movements included former outlaws who had become warriors with nothing left to lose. Then there were the mercenary soldiers who fought for money rather than loyalty. In theory, they were legal. In practice, many became little better than bandits when wars ended. Unemployed and heavily armed, they terrorized the countryside, especially in places like Italy, where the economy was fractured and political chaos reigned. These men formed free companies, bands of ex-soldiers who offered their services to the highest bidder, or simply helped themselves to food, gold, and land. In some regions, outlawry became so widespread that it took on a strange gray zone status. Some local lords even used outlaws to fight rival nobles or harass tax collectors. Criminals were sometimes hired as enforcers, spies, or assassins. Justice, in these cases, bent to politics. What mattered wasn't whether someone had broken the law, but whose law they had broken. Interestingly, some outlaws were offered redemption through service or penance. A thief might be sent to fight in a crusade instead of being executed. A bandit could earn a pardon by capturing another criminal. This idea of conditional mercy, serve the crown and your sins are erased, was often pragmatic. Rulers needed soldiers more than they needed corpses. Yet for all the danger they posed, outlaws were also romanticized. Stories of brave robbers and clever escape artists spread far and wide. The line between criminal and folk hero blurred, especially in poor communities where justice felt unfair. Even today, names like Robin Hood endure, rooted in real fears and fantasies of a time when justice was brutal, and the law did not always protect the weak. In the end, the outlaw was not just a figure of fear. He was a mirror showing the cracks in the system, the desperation of the poor, and the limits of authority. The forest was not just a place to hide. It was a place to resist, because when justice failed, the outlaws came. In modern times, justice means evidence, lawyers, and fair trials in neutral courtrooms. But in the medieval world, justice was rarely so neat. Instead of clear laws and trained judges, there were layers of overlapping authority: kings, lords, priests, guilds, and local assemblies, all claiming the right to enforce order in their own way. Medieval trials didn't always seek truth the way we understand it. They sought to preserve balance, punish sin, and satisfy power. The first thing to understand is that there was no single legal system. Instead, there were many. A crime committed in one village might be judged by the manorial court, ruled over by the local lord or his appointed bailiff. Another offense, committed in a different town, might fall under the 100 court, borough court, or even royal courts, especially if it threatened the king's peace. Then there were the ecclesiastical courts, which handled matters of morality, marriage, wills, and sin. Each court had its own customs, penalties, and standards. This fragmented system meant that justice could be wildly inconsistent. Two people could commit the same crime, but receive completely different punishments, depending on who judged them and where. Wealth, status, and political alliances played a major role. A nobleman had far more legal protections than a peasant. A cleric accused of wrongdoing could claim the benefit of clergy and be tried by church courts, where the punishments were often milder. In many places, manorial courts were the primary form of local justice. These courts met regularly, sometimes once a month, in the Lord's Hall or a public space. The lord or his steward presided, and local villagers served as jurors, not in the modern sense of impartial arbiters, but as witnesses who knew the people involved. Accusations were made publicly, and the accused had to answer for their actions on the spot. Sometimes, trials lasted minutes. The verdict might be based on reputation, gossip, or tradition more than evidence. For more serious crimes, such as murder, robbery, arson, or rape cases, might be escalated to the king's court or the shire court, overseen by royal justices. These men traveled in circuits, hearing cases on behalf of the crown. Their arrival in a town was a major event. Villagers gathered, criminals were brought in, and justice was dispensed rapidly. These sessions were known as assizes, and they aimed to remind everyone of royal authority. But trials in royal courts still lacked many modern safeguards. There were no police detectives, no lawyers for the defense. The accused often had to defend themselves. Witnesses could be bribed or intimidated. Trial outcomes were heavily influenced by social class, religious standing, and who owed favors to whom, in place of solid evidence. Medieval trials leaned heavily on ordeals, oaths, and character. One method was the compurgation system, where the accused had to bring a group of people, often 12 or more, to swear on the Bible that they believed he was innocent. These oath helpers were not required to provide evidence. Their support alone could acquit a defendant. The logic was simple. If a man had the trust of his community, he must be innocent. But not everyone could find willing oath helpers, and not every case could be settled by reputation alone. So medieval courts sometimes turned to trial by ordeal, an ancient and deeply symbolic method that relied on divine intervention. If human witnesses couldn't settle the matter, God would. 1. Ordeal was the ordeal by fire. The accused might be required to carry a red-hot iron bar a certain distance, or place their hand in boiling water to retrieve an object. The wound would then be bandaged and inspected after a few days. If it healed cleanly, the person was judged innocent. If it festered, they were guilty. Another version involved walking barefoot over red-hot plowshares. Again, survival and healing were seen as signs of divine favor. Then there was the ordeal by water, often used for women or those accused of witchcraft. The accused was tied and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, it was believed that the pure water had rejected them. They were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, but might drown in the process. It was a lose-lose situation, terrifying for anyone caught in the system. These ordeals were often conducted with religious ceremony. Priests would bless the tools, pray for divine judgment, and witness the results. The church tried to distance itself from these rituals as time went on, but in the early and high Middle Ages, ordeals were a central part of trial culture, terrifying blend of law and faith. By the 13th century, ordeals began to fall out of favor. The church officially banned its involvement in them after 1215, leading secular courts to rely more on jury trials, especially in England. But these were not the juries we know today. They were composed of locals who already knew the people and events in question. Their goal was not neutrality, but community memory, a kind of social decision-making that reflected the collective view. Not an objective standard. Justice could be remarkably public. Trials were often held in marketplaces, churchyards, or on manorial greens. The accused stood before their neighbors, questioned openly, and received judgment on the spot. This made trials both frightening and performative. People attended not just to see justice done, but to participate in it. Sometimes, a trial ended with banishment rather than physical punishment. The guilty were ordered to leave the town or region within a set number of days. They were branded or marked to make them easier to recognize. Anyone who sheltered them risked punishment themselves. For those unable to flee or unwilling to return home, life became a wandering nightmare. Another option for the guilty was sanctuary. If a criminal could reach a church, they might claim protection under sacred law. Once inside, they had a limited time, usually 40 days, to confess, negotiate surrender, or agree to exile. Some used this to escape execution. Others simply delayed the inevitable. Sanctuary created a strange pause in justice, a place where spiritual mercy clashed with legal authority. In rare cases, prisoners could appeal directly to the king. These royal pardons were granted for many reasons: political loyalty, bribes, public pressure, or simple whim. A noble family might campaign for a pardon, or a town might beg for leniency for one of its own. If granted, the pardon could erase a crime entirely. This reminded everyone who truly held the power. The king's word could override law, evidence, or punishment. Justice flowed downward from crown to court to community. For most people, though justice was harsh, fast, and inescapable, trials rarely ended in acquittal. Even when the accused was spared execution, they often lost property, family, or freedom, and the scars, physical or reputational, lasted for life. Still, people clung to the system. It gave structure to their world. It kept neighbors in line and defined what was acceptable. Even if the courts were flawed, they were better than chaos. Because, in the medieval mind, justice wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about order, obedience, and survival. As we step back and look at the landscape of medieval crime and punishment of brutal executions, public humiliation, outlaw hunters, and divine trials, it's tempting to view the entire system as backwards, cruel, or even barbaric. But that view misses a deeper truth. For all its violence and fear, medieval justice was not just about punishing wrongdoers. It was about holding a fragile society together. In a world constantly on the edge of collapse, where famine, plague, war, and social unrest were common threats, order meant survival. People didn't demand justice as we define it today. They needed security. They needed predictability. They needed to know what would happen if someone stole a sheep or insulted a priest or broke the curfew. Punishment was often severe because fear was one of the few tools available to discourage crime. When police, prisons, and forensic science didn't exist. But it wasn't just fear. Shame was a weapon too. Public punishment wasn't about hiding criminals away. It was about displaying them, exposing them, using them as cautionary examples. Stocks, pillories, scarlet letters, public whippings all served the same function: to show the crowd what would happen if they stepped out of line. Children watched their elders punished. Wives saw husbands disgraced. Everyone learned the lesson. Conformity was safety. This approach deeply shaped how people thought about law. In many villages, justice didn't come from the state or the king. It came from neighbors. If someone lied, cheated, or cursed, it was the community that called it out. Guilt wasn't always about evidence. It was about reputation. Once a person was believed to be dangerous or untrustworthy, that label could stick for life. Redemption was rare. The line between accused and condemned could be frighteningly thin, and yet people weren't helpless. Communities weren't just passive victims of harsh laws. They actively participated in enforcing and shaping them. Local juries, church gossip, guild enforcement, market supervision, these were all tools for maintaining peace. Most disputes never reached a courtroom or gallows. Instead, they were settled quietly through compensation, apology, or exile. The real goal wasn't always punishment. It was restoration. Still, when things did go wrong, when a murderer was caught, a thief was exposed, or a heretic was dragged from the shadows, the entire system shifted into performance mode. Punishment became public theater. Executions were staged for maximum effect. In some cases, the condemned were forced to confess or preach repentance before being hanged or burned. Their deaths became spiritual warnings. The audience was supposed to walk away afraid of sin, afraid of disobedience, afraid of stepping outside the social order. This fear was carefully maintained by religious and secular powers alike. The church taught that earthly crimes reflected eternal sins. Disobeying a lord could mean damnation. Disrespecting your parents could bring a curse. Law and faith worked hand in hand, reinforcing the same message. Be obedient, be quiet, and stay in your place. That's what much of medieval justice really came down to: control. In a world without strong central governments, law became a way to protect the hierarchy. Lords punished peasants harshly to assert dominance. Kings executed rebels not just for treason, but as a message to everyone else. Even minor crimes like poaching or speaking out of turn could trigger a violent response, because allowing small disobediences risked inviting larger rebellions, and the threat wasn't theoretical. Uprisings did happen. From the English peasants' revolt to German farmer wars to French and Italian riots, the medieval period saw frequent resistance from the poor and oppressed. Each time, the ruling classes cracked down with ferocity. Leaders were executed, towns fined, villages burned. The lesson was always the same: the law doesn't bend, and power does not forgive. Yet despite all this brutality, people still hoped for justice. They prayed to saints, they wept at trials, they begged for mercy. Some rulers were remembered for fairness. Some towns developed reputations for leniency. The concept of equity, the idea that punishment should fit the crime and consider the circumstances, was present, even if inconsistently applied. Documents survive of people acquitted, pardoned, or shown compassion. The system was flawed, but it wasn't inhuman. In fact, some parts of medieval justice eventually evolved into more modern ideas. Jury trials, common law, evidence-based rulings all began to take root in the later Middle Ages. As governments centralized and literacy grew, so did the idea that law should be written, predictable, and accessible to everyone. Harsh spectacle began to give way to more bureaucratic forms of justice. Public hangings were replaced with imprisonment. Ordeals disappeared. Lawyers emerged. Still, the legacy of medieval punishment lingers in our collective imagination. Whenever we picture dark dungeons, masked executioners, or angry mobs at the gallows, we're tapping into that distant past. We remember the fear, the spectacle, the raw balance between chaos and control. And even in our modern systems with their courts, cameras, and rules, we still wrestle with some of the same questions. What is justice really for? Is it to punish the guilty? To protect the innocent? To keep people in line? Or is it something more complicated, a reflection of our values, fears, and power structures? The people of the Middle Ages didn't have time to ask these questions out loud. For them, justice had to be immediate, visible, and effective. It had to work without doubt or delay. But in doing so, it sometimes sacrificed truth, mercy, and even reason. Yet, within that system, people still sought fairness. They cried for reform. They resisted when they could. And slowly, painfully, They push justice toward something better. So the next time you read about a thief's hand being cut off, a woman ducked in a river, or a crowd cheering at a hanging cause, and remember the world they lived in. A world where justice was survival, where order was everything, and where, sometimes the only thing standing between chaos and community was fear. The Middle Ages may be gone, but their lessons linger, not just in books, but in the very bones of our laws,